Hi class, week 14, the last week of the semester. Yay! I have my trusted assistant here, Kashada. I don't know if you can hear her purring, I can hear her in my ear. So let's wrap up. Actually, this is going to be part one. This is a short discussion of the readings and the ecomateriality of film. And then at the end of the week I will post another video that's sort of a wrap-up of the course material and also a review for the final. I'll post more details about that on the class website. Okay, so let's jump into it. So the first article, very short, just 15 pages, by Nadia Bozak on the idea of the resource image. So let me break down this concept for you. It's pretty straightforward. We talked about it throughout the class for the most part, but let's specifically talk about her reading. Okay, so I have here the example of day after tomorrow. So a resource image is like two sides of a coin. There's two aspects of it. There's the discursive political resources that the images have, which is the ideas that are embedded in an image or a moving image, as the case would be with film. And then the image as a resource itself, like water, something that comes into our houses. Let's talk about the first part, the image as cultural and political resource. So in the case of the day after tomorrow, which we've seen and we've talked quite a bit about, it warns about dangers of global warming. The critique of it, as we talked about in the past few weeks, is that it encourages this particular ecological panoptic view which normalizes U.S. hegemony, so it doesn't really critique or challenge the existing system, even though it warns us about the perils of climate change, and that it's a kind of eco-spectacle. Okay, so that describes the ideas we see in the movie. But what is the image or the moving images in the case of the film as an environmental resource? So you have the technical infrastructure, you have the supply chain that made the technology possible, you have the material containing the images. I gave different examples of images that we would be normally accustomed to finding in the media, such as newspapers, TVs, computers, etc. We have the data files, which exist on servers, and their storage and use produces CO2. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But the film also purports to be carbon neutral. That is, it used carbon offsets. A carbon offset is like, let's say I know that flying from Europe to the US produces a certain amount of CO2. I can calculate that, and then I can donate money to an NGO that plants trees, and those trees will offset the pollution or the CO2 that I produce. So this is a fairly problematic industry. I'm not going to get into that now, but in any case, that's when film says they're carbon neutral. That's what it means, that they donate money to offset their carbon emissions by planting trees, or I don't know if there's other ways to do it, but usually it has to do with planting trees. So there's this great quote from Nadia Bozak. Here's a picture of her in Mexico. And I'll just read it to you incomplete here. What would happen if an end of oil affects not only the functioning of society and culture at large, and on a global level, but also as a consequence the way moving images are produced and received? So moving images are as vital to our lives as water, gas, these things that we expect to come into our house. The internet is another one of these things that pipes into our house, and we take for granted that there's this vast infrastructure that produces that. And if that infrastructure is based on, let's say, non-renewable energies such as coal or oil, what happens when those resources disappear? Will our images disappear? Well, that remains to be seen. Okay, so the other article we looked at was 500,000 kilowatts of stardust, which is, I think, a nice little introduction to the issue of the eco-materiality of filmmaking. It's short, so be sure to read it. In particular, he focuses on the use of water as in the case study of Singing in the Rain, a very famous film, which is a film about filmmaking. It's an example of meta cinema. If you haven't seen it, it's a great movie from the early 50s. I encourage you to do that. But one thing that he points out in the discussion of this film, in looking at the different books and research that's done about how it's made, there has been zero research about what are the material impacts of making a film like this. In particular, what about the use of water? So this film has a lot of scenes that involve rain, and how do you create those scenes? How much water is being used? And I think the article does a nice job of sort of explaining how intense that is. So let me just read you a few quotes from the article. How has water been integrated into the production of mainstream movies? In terms of its extra filmic consumption, from the basic hydration of cast and crew to the use of water for cooling post-production digital memory servers to California's reliance on hydroelectric power, as well as its textual role in setting and prop from manufactured oceans to artificial rainfall. As this film reinforces through its representational meanings, its production practices, and its various layers of discourse, the Hollywood spectacle is not to be limited by the frugality of nature. So in the case study of Singing in the Rain, he points out that they had a lot of problems with water pressure at certain times of the day, because when they turn on the artificial rain systems while they're in the studios, there would be low pressure because, guess what? At 5 o'clock, people came home from work and turned on the water to water their lawns, and that was just pointing out the fact that the water system that the movie studios used was part of the water system that people relied on for everyday life. Here I included two images. Let me move this so you can just take a look at that. This is from the making of Blade Runner, the film we watched this semester, and here's the scene with this water. So to create all those waves, they had to build a big tank. They had to have all these machines and hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. So that water is not digitally produced. That's real. So it's an actual resource. So I just wanted to point that out in one of the examples. We talked about Mad Max earlier this semester, but Blade Runner also, here's a good example of intensive resource use. So I just want to read another quote from this article. Film, like its users, needs water. And once that water goes through its system, film has to excrete the waste left behind. In other words, what happens to that water after you use it? Water is a necessary element in multiple levels throughout the life cycle of a film, as both an article of representation and an essential part of the chemical processes that make up both analog and digital movie magic possible. So, for example, one thing the article points out is that actual film, film stock, not digital, but real film stock, has chemicals, and it uses a lot of water in the production of film stock. Also, data centers need water for cooling and things like that. So water is a very important aspect of media production. The recent turn to more sustainable, environmentally conscious practices has elicited some water-based solutions, such as a shift from individual disposable water bottles back to old-school collective water cooler efficiency, which stands out as a pretty consistent greening initiative of mainstream production practices. However, the real problems lie, as they often do, behind the scenes in the processes that are not highlighted in information brochures. So a studio might say, yes, we're greening our production because everyone has their own water bottle, but they're not talking about the big infrastructure issues of, in the case of water, the massive amounts of water consumed to make films. And then this last quote, it's actually a little bit depressing. The water use of 500,000 viewers, that is, the amount of water that 500,000 viewers use is what is used to make, let's say, a few minutes of movie. Think about that. To make up a raw cultural material, the majority of which will end up as waste on the cutting room floors. And then I'll close with this quote from the article. It is about turning natural resources into money, one prominent characterization of Hollywood. So this ties back into the last few weeks of course material. We looked a lot about what was going on in the Amazon and the Andes and how multinational corporations were going into these territories to get resources. But, where are these resources going? Well, they go into our products and the things that we buy and consume here in Europe or the United States. So, the same business model of those corporations going to a forest and extracting raw materials is not that much different than the business model of a Hollywood film, which is also extracting raw materials to produce something for our consumption. We did talk about this with Mad Max, but let me just return to that sort of overview of what are the environmental impacts for movie production. We have pre-production, which is the planning of the film, the production aspect, which is creating, building all the sets, the actual shooting and filming, post-production, which is all the stuff you do with the special effects, things you do after you shoot the film. Then you have distribution, cinema, DVDs, etc. You can add Netflix to that. Film tourism, so we talked a little bit about that in the case of Mad Max, but Star Wars, all these other movies, people like to go visit the sets. And then the marketing, which also has an impact. So, throughout the whole production chain of film production, there's some impacts. Now, the film I ask you to watch this week, I don't want to give it away because I want you to watch it, to think about it on your own, but let me just point out that the name of the film, the Lanthanide series, comes from the periodic table. Here it is. And it has to do specifically with types of elements that are used in the technology that we use every day and we take for granted, like, for example, in our gadgets and cell phones. So let me just review the overall ecological impact of our media usage. So I'm going to focus primarily on gadgets here. So gadgets have at least 30 elements that are extracted from our planet. Wiring requires copper, gold, and silver. Batteries depend on lithium and cobalt. Displays use iridium, terbium, and dysprosium. The source of energy that powers our information exchange is largely powered by coal. Packaging, which requires paper pulp, is resource intensive. Shipping and manufacturing add to greenhouse gas emissions because stuff has to go all over the world, in big giant container ships, airplanes, etc. The massive amount of energy required to make silicon chips is another major impact. So, to make a silicon chip, you have to have these furnaces that melt this materials down, like actually have to melt things like coal and sand into a liquid. That takes huge amounts of energy. E-waste, which is a toxic brew of chemicals, plastic, glass, and metal, devastates the health of workers that make these gadgets, but also local ecosystems where they're made. Server farms, they make up the digital cloud used for our streaming services, data, and social networks, and all the energy they consume that comes from non-renewable resources like coal and natural gas. So that's already a very big, intensive impact on our environment. Most of these are mined in the poorer regions of the world. So let me go back to the subject of the past few weeks of transnational ecocinema, indigenous ecocinema. All these minerals and resources used for our gadgets and for our films and for our pleasure and our enjoyment are coming out of these regions. And they're devastating local ecologies and corrupting political processes. For example, the struggle of who has rights to lithium in Bolivia has contributed to its political crisis. And in the Congo, wars and ecosystem devastation has led many of these elements to be labeled as conflict minerals. And so this is just a visual summary of these impacts. You have the conflict minerals in places like Africa, you have e-waste, you have the digital cloud being powered by non-renewable energy resources, you have here the production system in China, which is akin to a certain type of slavery, and then also electromagnetic radiation, which we haven't talked about. That's a topic for another course. You can want to take the media and the environment next fall. I'll talk a lot more about electromagnetic energy, but this is essentially emissions from like Wi-Fi and cell phones and things like that. Okay, so I'll close this part of the lecture by just drawing attention to the ecomaterialism of our course, which is on Moodle. So What is the actual ecological footprint of this course? Well, I don't know how to calculate it exactly, but just think about conceptually, we have the production impacts of the films we watched. We have the impact of gadgets and computers we are using to watch these films. And then we have the impact of servers used by the class. In other words, we have our class on Moodle, which is on servers, which uses the cloud. We use the internet to access all of our materials, and then Mega is the storage service that I put all of our films on for us to download. So these all have huge environmental impacts. Obviously, it's not something we can really avoid at the moment, but we have to think about how can we improve our systems so that they're not so damaging to our global planetary ecology. For example, promoting clean energy instead of coal or gas to power our data and our internet. Also to encourage the companies to design products that aren't breaking every 6 months, that they last longer, and to develop materials that are not damaging to ecosystems or the planet. Okay, so that's part 1 of this week. Later in the week I'll post a review of the course material and a discussion of the final. Until then, have a great week.